Welcome to our keynote speech, A Decade of Action Now to 2030. And I'm delighted to introduce our keynote speaker, Lord Adair Turner, who chairs the Energy Transition Commission. The Commission is a global coalition of major energy and industrial companies, investors, NGOs, and experts who are working on ways to limit global warming to well below 2 degrees C, and while stimulating economic development and social progress. Adair is also chairman of Chubb Europe and on the advisory board of Shanghai-based Envision Energy, and a former chairman of the Institute for New Economic Thinking. After the session, we should have about 5 minutes or so for questions. So please do enter questions in the question box if you have any. So Adair, welcome, and over to you.
Thank you, Ian, and it's a great pleasure to be talking at this conference of the World Cement Association. We are coming up to 6 years, it was originally meant to be 5 years, from the Paris COP21 event, and the world will gather in Glasgow in just over a week's time to look at the progress of the Paris Agreement on climate change and to energize further action. The Paris Agreement in 2015 committed the world to limit global warming to well below 2 degrees centigrade and ideally to 1.5 degrees centigrade. And it set up a process, not a legal process, but a voluntary process by which countries would make national determined contributions, statements of what they would do to meet that objective. Since the Paris conference, I think there has been an interesting mix of concerning developments and very good developments in the fight against climate change. The concerning developments is that it is absolutely clear that climate change is continuing and that its impacts are in some senses becoming more apparent and worse at an earlier stage of warming than we thought. The world since pre-industrial times has now warmed about 1.1, 1.2 degrees centigrade, but that warming is continuing. Concentrations of CO2 in the atmosphere are continuing to rise. Methane emissions and methane flows into the atmosphere have continued to rise. And we are seeing around the world, particularly this year with the extraordinary floods in Germany, in China, in India, and the wildfires on West Coast America, clear evidence of what climate change can do to the world, even at a warming of 1.1 to 1.2 degrees centigrade, let alone the 1.5 or the 2 degrees centigrade. So all of that is concerning and means that we really do have to accelerate progress at Glasgow. The good news is that over the last 5 or 6 years, we have seen remarkable technological progress, and it has become increasingly clear how we can build a net zero economy, increasingly clear that we can do that at affordable cost by around mid-century, and increasingly clear what the technologies are. At the absolute core of getting to a zero carbon economy, one has to electrify as much of the economy as possible, and we have to completely decarbonize electricity production. And we now can do that far cheaper than we originally believed possible, because the cost of solar PV has come down 85% in the last decade. The cost of batteries down about 85%. The cost of wind power down 60 or 70%. What is also collapsing is the cost of producing hydrogen in a green fashion from electrolysis, building on that renewables. And that is also creating new opportunities to decarbonize the economy. And even on what have been called the hard to abate sectors of the economy, steel and cement, chemicals, long distance aviation and shipping, we now have clear visions of how to get to net zero by 2050. And the Energy Transitions Commission played a major role in setting out that vision in what was called our Mission Possible report in autumn 2018. These are more difficult sectors of the economy to decarbonize. They are sectors of the economy where there will probably be a net cost to decarbonize, unlike in road transport, where within 10 years or so, people will be spending less on owning and running their cars than they do today. So it is more technologically difficult. It is more expensive, but for every one of the hard to abate sectors, we now know how to get to net zero by 2050. And the good news is that because of that, sectors and companies and countries across the world are making commitments to be at net zero by 2050 or 2060. And it's our belief at the Energy Transition Commission that the standard should be all rich developed economies should get there by 2050, poorer developing countries might take till 2060. And we now have 70% of the GDP of the world covered by one or other form of a net zero commitment for mainly for 2050 and then China for 2060. So in many ways, there's good news. But if you could just put up the first slide now, there is still a fundamental problem, which this slide will illustrate. To limit global warming, or to indeed to have even a 50% chance of limiting global warming, we need emissions to be on something like the green path there. And that is a path of not only getting emissions down to around zero, close to zero by mid-century, but it is also, and this is crucial, cutting emissions by something like 40% in the 2030s. We need to be on a concave path of reduction towards zero. But if you take the national determined contributions, these voluntary commitments that countries have so far input to the Glasgow COP26 process, and you add them up, and there are various people who've been doing that, you could believe that we're somewhere like on the lower of the blue lines, which you can see further up on this slide. And what you can see there is a reduction which doesn't yet get us to zero by 2050, because these NDCs are a little bit behind the net zero commitments. They're not yet clearly caught up with that, but crucially, which does not get us that reduction in the 2030s. The NDCs, which are really meant to be the lever which gets the short-term reductions, are beginning to turn that curve, but they are suggesting that at very most, we will head on a reduction on a convex path, not on a concave path. So the crucial thing in Glasgow, the crucial debate is going to be, can we close that gap? Can we take actions in this next decade, a crucial decade of action, which will take us from the blue path, the lower of the blue paths there, to that green path? The Energy Transition Commission has addressed that issue. Can we close that gap? In a recent report that we have called Keeping 1.5 degrees centigrade alive. And we actually believe that it is technologically and economically possible to close that gap and to get the commitments in Glasgow, which could close most of that gap, by 3 sets of actions which would build on top of the national determined contributions. And if we go to the next slide, you'll see what those actions are. They include in the, actually there are 5 actions here. I should have mentioned one other. Let me mention one other first. One action not on this path, because this one covers CO2, is to reduce methane emissions. Methane is a hugely powerful greenhouse gas, and cutting methane emissions is one of the quickest ways to start reducing the temperature increase, because methane, when it's up in the atmosphere, dissipates quite quickly. And we believe there is an opportunity to cut methane emissions, in particular methane emissions from the fossil fuel production process, by 40% during the next decade, including by many actions that coal producers, oil and gas producers can take, which have a zero or negative cost of implementation. But in addition to cutting methane emissions by 40%, there are these 5 actions that you can see set out across the page here. Some of them have to do with nature. They're about ending deforestation and beginning a process of reforestation. Some of them are about the power sector, and here the crucial challenge is to move beyond simply saying no new coal to begin to take existing coal out of the system. Those are the two biggest, and the challenge of those two big ones, the sort of greeny turquoise one and the red one, is that those will require money to flow from the rich developed countries to enable less developed countries to pay for some of those big actions. But in addition to those, and significant, there are three sets of actions where what needs to happen is spread across the world, where the key thing is a sectoral focus, and where many of the actions are lower cost. And those three are accelerating road transport electrification, for instance, by agreeing across the world a total ban on all new passenger car and light duty internal combustion engine sales by 2035. They are on the right-hand side accelerating energy and resource efficiency improvements, and they are in the middle, the supply side decarbonization in other sectors. And it is in there that we have put what needs to happen in the hard to abate sectors of the economy. Now, the hard to abate sectors of the economy, and cement is one of those, are indeed harder to abate. And cement, I have to say, is one of the most hard to abate sectors of the economy. In steel, for instance, it is possible that if the cost of green hydrogen gets low enough, it may eventually be the case that making steel from green hydrogen may be even cheaper than making it from coking coal. So eventually there may be no green cost premium for decarbonizing steel. There will be in transition, but eventually there is a technology which has the possibility, at least, as of being as cheap as the existing technology. But cement is one sector where we really don't know how to get to zero carbon except by adding carbon capture and storage to the existing processes. There are lots of other things the industry has to do as well, but actually to get to net zero, it needs to do that because of those process emissions resulting from the very chemical process of turning calcium carbonate into calcium oxide. So in the cement sector, we know there will be an additional cost, and we know that it will take time. And it is in these hard to abate sectors that we are faced above all with this convex curve, that even once one has decided that it is possible, that one can describe the technologies of how to get to zero in 2050, it will still take time to get going. But it is absolutely crucial to get going. And it is absolutely crucial that the cement industry, like the steel industry, like the shipping industry, and like the aviation industry and chemicals, even if it knows the reduction path will look somewhat convex, commits to two things. One, to squeezing out as many emissions reductions as it can do, even in the 2020s, by, for instance, improving the energy efficiency of all key kiln operations, by trying to change the precise balance of the cement chemistry, and by beginning to employ carbon capture and storage. But it is also crucial that the cement industry begins to take the actions now in the 2020s, which make it credible that you will be on a path of very significant reductions by 2040 and zero by 2050. So within that 2.1, actually the biggest figure we put in was a steel reduction of about 1 gigaton. It turns out that in steel, unlike I think in cement, one could get a reduction of as much as 35% in the 2020s by transitional technological steps. We haven't seen that opportunity in cement. We see more like maybe 0.3 gigaton reduction in the industry by 2030, with maybe a 10 to 15% reduction. But the crucial thing in the hard to abate sectors of the economy, and above all of cement, is to measure the progress in the 2020s, not only by the beginning of an actual material reduction, but by having clear pathways and strategies, clear investment plans, clear technological developments, clear commitments to work out, if it's carbon capture and storage, how that's going to be done, when it's going to be installed. One needs to be on a path which is beginning to get the reductions we need in the 2020s, but is on a clear and believable path to that net zero by 2050, which we need to achieve. Let me finish there. I'm very happy to take some questions.
So Adair, thank you very much. And we'll get some, if you have questions for Adair, then do put them into the question box. But Adair, can I start by asking you something that has struck me particularly recently? If we look at if I look at the cement industry, I'm sure you look at more industries than I do, but if we look at the industries that we're familiar with, we can see a lot of things going on which make us optimistic that progress is being made and that there is potential to get to net zero and to do so without it being very, very expensive. You know, there are new technologies that offer lower cost potential. But when we look at the macro numbers, as you showed in your first slide, or we could perhaps look at the proportion of primary energy coming from fossil fuels, progress is terribly slow. In fact, maybe we can't even call it progress at all. I think in your slide, the progress is as a result of COVID, which hopefully we won't repeat. Are there macro indicators that perhaps are a little bit lead indicators that will start to give us something on the overall picture that we should be looking at, in addition to the energy mix and the figures that you were showing on emissions?
I think what's interesting is, of course, that often when you get changes in systems, in this case, how we get our energy, it follows an S-curve where, to begin with, there's a lot of stuff going on. There's a lot of high levels of growth rates, for instance, of renewables. But because it's starting from a low base, it can't yet change the overall numbers. And then you get to a point of inflection where it begins to make a big difference. And I truly think we are at a point of inflection now in the world economy. The good news, and I didn't mention it, is I am absolutely certain that the reduction in emissions in the 2020s will be faster than those NDCs which have committed to the Paris process, because many of the NDCs committed to the Paris process have not yet caught up in political commitments with what is happening in the technologies in any case. Let's take, for instance, road transport. Up until now, the number of electric cars on the road is still just 1 or 2% of all the cars in the world. But what we are beginning to get in Europe is things like 10 or 15 and then 20% of the new cars are electric, and I think that'll be 30 or 40% in a few years' time, and 70 or 80% by 2030. And when you get that, you just inevitably, 5 years later, the numbers of the stock on the road begin to change. The amount of petrol and diesel being consumed begins to come down. And we can see how that S-curve is working in road transport. We can also see it in the whole area of electricity generation. Let's take actually the UK. In just 2010, UK electricity had a carbon intensity, grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour that you consumed, of about 550. You can get an app now, I have it on my mobile phone, that tells you minute by minute what that intensity is, and it's been running at about 220 now. We have got that big reduction, and many other countries are on the verge of that. I think across Europe and across the US, we are going to see dramatic decarbonization of the electricity systems in the 2020s. So I do think there are forward indicators of very significant change. I think if we were getting together in 2031, we will see that that line has come down, maybe not as fast as it should come down, but it will have come down. So yes, I do see some reasons for optimism that it's possible and that things will occur. I think left to themselves and without forceful government policies across the world and further commitments between countries to accelerate action sector by sector, we will get reduction, but it won't be as much as I illustrated was required on that chart.
Well, perhaps we can close on a slightly more optimistic note. I saw that you just have this relatively small reduction penciled in for the cement industry, and hopefully the topics that we talk about on the agenda today will at least show we have the potential to do something that's closer to the steel industry and get to a reduction of perhaps another third or so over the next decade.
Well, so a third over the decade would be great. I mean, when I've looked at steel industry, and maybe we should have talked to you before and grabbed that offer and put it into our figures. Look, certainly I think the cement industry should be looking at least, say, 15%. We know what it is. It's efficiency gains in the cement and the binders. It's changes in the balances of clinker to cement. It's the beginning of carbon capture and storage. There will be some benefit from the scope 2 emissions as electricity systems begin to decarbonize. And of course, cement companies can drive that by making commitments only to buy renewable energy through RE100. So I think, you know, the key message is what we need from the cement industry is as maximum as possible action in the 2020s, both in terms of the reductions actually delivered, but also crucially, investments this decade that make one able to say, by 2040, it'll be down 60 or 70% and then down to zero by 2050.
So Adair, thank you very much for your speech this morning. I think you've given us excellent framing for the conference, both in terms of what the world has to do and the role that the cement industry can play. So many thanks.
Thank you very much indeed. Nice being with you.
Bye-bye.